So guys, we're picking up where we left off on practicing the way. For those of you who are just joining in or catching up, the basic premise of this focus is that Jesus didn't just give us truths to believe, he gave us practices to follow. So this is part of what it means to follow Jesus. It's not just to become more like him in character, it's to literally do some of the things he did so that we become more like him, more loving, more compassionate, more humble, all of that. And so we kicked it off with talking about simplicity, and simplicity of schedule and stuff, and even just mindset, simplicity of heart. And the challenge we gave you was to look for ways to basically make room in our homes, in our schedules, and in our hearts for what matters most. And then last week was the second practice. So what we're doing is we're kind of incrementally building on them. Like, let me use a sports analogy. Like, if you want to get really good in sports, you need to practice, but you need to isolate certain skill sets and learn muscle memory and things like that. And so they all work together, all these different practices, but we're focusing in on them. Then we did Sabbath last week, and that idea is just carving out time every week to have dedicated time where you stop working, where you rest and you remember and you celebrate all that God has done. And so that was the challenge last week. And I'm going to ask if Colton and Grace could just come on up at this time. I was just chatting with them, and they were sharing about how they, as a young married couple, have actually, you can grab those mics on the front row there, they've actually been experimenting with Sabbath. And I said, we've got to have you guys just share about your experience, what's gone well, what's been difficult. You guys have been married, like a little over a year now? Yeah.
A little over.
And so if you wouldn't mind, just anything you want to share about your experiments with practicing Sabbath.
Well, it's such a God coincidence that you guys are going through Bridgetown Audio and all that really cool stuff. For the past couple months, we felt led to just really practice Sabbath. The meaning, what it is, the commandment, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, and above all things, keep it holy. It's not just rest for your body, not just rest for your mind, not just rest for your soul, but to really dive into remember that it is a holy day, and it's a day that God created, that he didn't need, but he knew that we needed it. And so we've been practicing it and studying it. And So.
What does that look? Can I ask just what does that look like for you guys? Recognizing, right, that everyone's a little different, but for you two as a couple, what does that mean?
Well, sorry, I'm kind of nervous.
Yeah, just keep. Oh, good, thank you. Let's just give them a big round of applause. Woo! Yeah, you guys are doing it. No, just keep the mic close to your mouth. That'd be great.
Okay. So it didn't always look. Well, it's never going to look perfect, but we used to practice Sabbath on different days, and that was something that didn't really work out for us because we felt like that's something that God wanted us to do together because we're married as one. And so we started.
Well, I'll just interject. Julie and I have done that, and it's actually kind of hard if she's really trying to rest, and I'm like stirring up a cloud of dust working around her, you know what I mean? So I'm like typically not home on her Sabbath because it doesn't line up for us. But you guys have said, let's try doing it on the same day.
Yes, which is Sundays now.
Yes.
And so we had to rearrange our Sundays because that was our day to grocery shop and do a million things. But there is going to be some sacrifice when it comes to Sabbath and preparation. And
So what did you do? Even just grocery shopping, did you just pivot to let's see if we can get that done Saturday?
Yes.
Or? Okay.
So he works nights on Saturdays and I'm off. And so we do it in the morning on Saturdays.
Okay.
And Sundays we just come to church.
Yes.
And then use the rest of the day to just...
Which interesting, you made it the point at the beginning, Sabbath is a day holy unto the Lord, not a day to just do what I want. And the idea, some people have said, well, I can't make Sunday my Sabbath because I go to the worship service. And I'm like, wait a second. That's part of the Sabbath is coming together to praise and recognize God.
Yes.
Jews would go to synagogue on the Sabbath and that kind of thing. So, okay, so you get up and you don't have responsibilities to do all the grocery shopping.
Yes.
You come worship, and then what's the rest of the day look like for you guys?
So it kind of depends. Every other Sunday, because we've been learning about Sabbath and we've been practicing it, something so important to us is to have fellowship and with our friends and our family, and to get closer to them and hold each other accountable for Sabbath. So every other Sunday, we'll have friends over, family over, and we'll actually watch Bridgetown Church in their sermon series about Sabbath. And when we finish that, then we're going to have dinners at our home, or lunches, dinners, whatever you want to call it, at our home, and just to delight in what the Lord has provided for us.
Wow.
And really, really just calm our minds, calm our bodies, calm our souls.
So that is super intentional, and you're a few months into it.
Mm-hmm.
How's it going?
It is great.
Great.
It is
You're loving
fantastic.
it. Okay.
We feel so renewed every week.
Yeah.
We know that we've been having so many challenges recently, and it's really cool because when we slow down on our Sabbath day, we can really focus on the provision that God has over us. And when we slow down and we see those things, we count our blessings, we can see on how much He's actually present in our life, and it helps us become more aware of His presence.
Great. Anything you want to add to that?
No.
Okay. Can we just give him a big round of applause? Thank you so much, guys. You were awesome. That takes big courage to come up and talk about it. I heard a quote that when you pause a machine or like a video you're watching, it stops. When you pause a human being, it starts. It starts to rethink, to reimagine, to renew. And so this is a great gift God's given us, the gift of Sabbath. And today we're talking about the next one here. We're talking about silence and solitude. Silence and solitude. Now, I'm just looking out. A lot of diversity here on the introvert-extrovert scale. There's a lot of different young parents, with all the craziness of kids. There are some retirees who are here who have a different season of life. How does the idea of silence and solitude sound to you? More like a dream or more like torture? Go ahead and turn to the person next to you. Is silence and solitude something that's you're like, yes, that's my dream, or like nightmare? And it's so funny because for some, Rose, how about for you? Does the idea of silence and solitude dream or nightmare? Nightmare, okay. So it's so fascinating. Some people are like, what? I can't even imagine. And let's just put it on the table. We're coming from different angles and perspectives with this. I want to break down what this discipline or practice is, why it's valuable, and then some practical ways we can practice it in micro expressions as well as bigger expressions. Here's a definition we're going to play off. The Christian practice of solitude is the intentional, voluntary, temporary, and countercultural act of withdrawing from people to be alone with ourselves and God for the renewing and refining of our souls. So the first part of this is the intentional, voluntary, temporary. So this is different than if you're serving a life sentence in solitary confinement in a prison somewhere. That's not chosen, that's automatically given. This is something, that's what makes it countercultural, that we would actually choose to step away from the busyness and the society to be alone with ourselves and God. And the purpose of that is for renewing and refining. In many ways, this discipline is a counterbalance to what we're doing right now. We're in a corporate worship service here to come together to worship God. We talked a lot about missional life all summer. That is the idea of teaming up with other followers of Jesus to live on mission. This is basically like the opposite. It's getting alone with God for the transformation of our hearts and souls. This is the being before doing. And it's where we build our own personal relationship with God instead of coasting on or leeching on somebody else's. And so this has become throughout the centuries for Jesus, we'll see, and for his countless followers, this has become like the bread and butter discipline coupled with prayer for a dynamic spiritual life. And again, we're focusing on this one. Remember, they exist in community. They exist in synergy with other things. So community, hospitality, generosity. We're going to focus in on the silence and solitude part. It's not a life just of silence and solitude. It's chosen temporarily. And so I want to ask you to think about a time when you were alone, outdoors, somewhere beautiful, in nature, on a mountain or at the beach or in a park or a garden. And how did you feel? Just try and think back to the sights and the sounds, maybe the wind blowing or the waves lapping, the sound of birds or something like that. Was it a peaceful time? Times alone, just by ourselves, for total atheists, are renewing. And so what we're talking about is a little different than Buddhist mindfulness, being present in the moment and thinking about your breathing. We're talking about a communion with God in the midst of that experience. And many have found this to be a time and a place of spiritual rejuvenation, but I just need to tell you straight up, it can also be a furnace of transformation. And we're going to talk about that. That's the refining part. Let's talk about the silence aspect of this. There's two forms of the practice of silence. One is not talking as much or remaining completely silent. And I mentioned this in the simplicity of speech a couple weeks ago. This is something that followers of Jesus actually do, following his example to limit our verbiage and even sometimes remain completely silent. And this is not like giving somebody the silent treatment as a passive-aggressive way of getting back. No, this is about being changed to become more like Jesus. But I want to zoom in a little more on the second one, limiting or minimizing sound manufactured by humans. Do you realize? Let's try it right now. Let's just try a moment of complete silence. We can't. The buzzing and the whirring of machines. We're living in a technological environment, and it's so hard. There's earbuds where we listen to music or podcasts. There is the sound of machines and computers and cars and airplanes flying overhead. It's very hard to find ourselves able to get away from murmuring and chattering and rumbling and whatnot. But Christians throughout the ages, following Jesus' example, have chosen to attempt that, to pursue that. Why would we do this? Scripture is clear. Be still and know that I am God. In quietness and trust is your strength. There's something that we can discover and experience in silence and solitude that we cannot get in the busyness and the blessing of community. It is possible to have solitude but not silence. So you could be alone but listening to a podcast. It's possible to have silence but not solitude. You could be like monks. Think a bunch of monks in a room, all practicing a vow of silence together. We're going to talk about the coupling of these two. Solitude being alone, silence minimizing or reducing noise, specifically the noise of humans. And so we're going to look to Jesus' example. Spiritual greats throughout the centuries and in Scripture have done this. Abraham, patriarchs, Moses, David, Elijah, John the Baptist, Paul. We're going to zoom in on Jesus because we're focused on practicing the way of Jesus. And the first mention of Jesus practicing silence and solitude is recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels. We're going to look at Mark's version. This is Mark chapter 1. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. This is the word eremos. This is a lonely place, or you could say a solitary place. You could insert the word solitude. And he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. So the context here is Jesus is about 30 years old. This is prior to the start of his public ministry. That is what the Gospels talk about, what the things he said and the things he did and the impact he made through them. But here we see that this wilderness encounter, alone, without anybody else, but as we see God, the Father, ministering to him through angels. I want to just point out something here. Note the order of what happens. Jesus doesn't have to pass a test in order to get God's affirmation. Jesus doesn't go get sent out in the wilderness. You better get an A. He passes the test, and God's like, well done, good and faithful servant. No. And this is really important for us as followers of Jesus to understand the order. It starts with a surrender to God expressed in baptism, which I always just marvel at. If anybody didn't need to be baptized, it's the sinless Son of God, but he did it to fulfill all righteousness. He set the path for us to follow. And then he hears the Father, and he sees this vision of the heavens torn open, and the voice is heard, "You are my son, and you're my boy, and I am so proud of you." He hadn't healed anybody yet. He hadn't preached any great sermons yet. He hadn't done any great deeds yet. And he certainly hadn't suffered and died for the sins of the world yet. And yet he was embraced in the warm love of his Father. Guys, we've got to get this. This is step one for us. Surrendering to God and expressing that in baptism gives us a whole new identity. We become adopted, much-loved children of God. The second thing that's surprising is that instead of launching him to the synagogue or the temple or the crowds to do great stuff, he's sent out to be alone for 40 days. And it's almost like a trial by fire or an ordeal. And I've asked myself, wow, Jesus, he was sent out for the testing or the tempting of Satan. And I'm like, man, why did he need that? And this morning, it was early, it was like 3:30 a.m. I woke and I had the idea that if a bully is messing with you and threatening you, I know I'm not speaking here I'm not giving advice to anybody here who's being bullied, but I'm just saying if you live in fear of a bully, there might be a time when you need to just face that bully once and for all so you don't live under that pressure and that intense fear. And I wonder if God expedited this direct encounter with Satan so that Jesus could break free in victory and not have that lingering. It was almost like, I don't know, I'm guessing at that. Whatever the case, he was led into the tempting and he passed the test. And it says the angels strengthened him and they ministered to him. What happens next? Jesus comes out of that wilderness 40 years on fire. He's calling disciples. He's starting to launch his ministry, and there's authoritative teaching, healing, deliverance happening. All of that took place after he passed the test, facing down the enemy. And then it says, this is fascinating. We're going to continue on in Mark chapter 1, verse 35. Rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place. Same thing, the same word, a solitary place, the wilderness, somewhere where he was alone. And there he prayed. So this is, again, the common linkage of prayer with silence and solitude. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him, and they said, "Everyone's looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." I'm just saying that if there was ever a time to sleep in, I would think it would be the morning after Jesus had this banner day of ministry. He is just, everything's going right, and he stayed up late, and he poured it out. And in that moment, you would think, you deserve to sleep in, Jesus. But it was almost like his experience with God the Father alone in the 40 days of the wilderness. Yeah, he was physically weakened, but spiritually strengthened. It almost seems like it had become addicting to him. He couldn't get enough of it. It was like he craved it, and he craved it more than sleep. What he found and encountered with the Father alone in the wilderness was more desirable to him than sleeping in a little bit longer. And so we find him there. Where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? We can't find him. I bet let's go look out there. They found him alone. And this is the pattern that we're going to see throughout. I'm just going to show you a few examples of how Jesus, preceding every great ministry thing, every great impact moment, is time alone with the Father. And then after every great ministry moment, he's pulling away to get alone again. Luke 5:15-16, yet the news about him spread all the more. He is so popular. This is the height of popularity. Crowds of people came to hear him and be healed of this sickness. But Jesus often, not sometimes, not occasionally, not every now and then, it says he often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Another place, Matthew 14. The king had John beheaded in the prison. Just so you know, John, this is his cousin. He loved John dearly. They were very close. John had prepared the way for him to come. And his disciples came and took the body of John and buried it, and they went up and they told Jesus. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place. Same word again, that solitary place by himself. And so here's Jesus, broken by the news of what had happened. No doubt triggered with the imminence of what was going to face him. And what does he do? He goes alone to be with the Father. Actually, what happens in that incident is funny because he's trying to get away and the crowd comes to where he landed on shore. And so he actually extends himself even more and he feeds the multitudes. And then it says immediately, and then he dismisses the crowds, and it says immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. So here we see it again. It's just like the more expenditure he makes, the weaker he feels, the more he gets up early in the morning, stays up late at night, gets away from people to get recharged, to find the comfort, to find the strength to keep going. Whether it's a mountainside or a lake or a park outside of Jerusalem, or maybe even a closet that he talked about, a quiet nook somewhere when he says that's where you go to pray. And so I'm just thinking about this, and I've always thought Jesus was super spiritual, like, wow, he stayed up all night. Now I'm realizing, no, he was super desperate. He knew he could not go on with the motivation and the mission if he did not have that time alone with his Father, letting God affirm him and encourage him and strengthen him. We're going to talk about this in the next couple weeks. We're going to talk more about what that looks like to pray, to talk to God and to hear God. How do we hear God? What is the role of the Word of God in those moments? And how do we use the Bible in those moments? But today we're just looking at his example of getting alone with God. And we're comparing it to ourselves. Let's just be real. Where do you turn for comfort? Where do you turn when you feel tired, when you feel weak, when you've poured it out? I think it's fair enough to say some of us turn to sleep. Some of us turn to whatever distraction, a social media, or I just need to escape in a good movie or show or something like that. Maybe we go to hang out with people and get recharged, extroverts among us. But what we see in Jesus was alone time with the Father. And I want to ask, what are some of the barriers? Why don't we practice silence and solitude like Jesus? Here's some that could come up. You could say, I can't get away from the noise. There's no quiet place for me to go to. And that is quite possible. I mean, I'm thinking there's especially people, let's say if you've got, you can't drive, you're young, you're 14 years old, and you live in a house with a bunch of siblings, and you live in a neighborhood or an apartment building, and you don't have a place to go. Well, there is one place everyone can go where you can be alone. It's called the bathroom. And so you got to get creative sometimes and have extended bathroom time. You might say, well, I just don't have the time to do this. And what we see in Jesus, it was the busier he got, the more he made time for it. But I think that's not the biggest reason. I think number 3 is a big one, our addiction to distraction. The greatest threat to faith today, says Andrew Sullivan, is not hedonism. Hedonism is the pursuit of our pleasure that is contrary to God's desires for us, but distraction. This new epidemic of distraction is our civilization's specific weakness. And its threat is not so much to our minds, even as they shape-shift under the pressure. The threat is to our souls. At any rate, if the noise does not relent, we might even forget that we have any. There is an addiction to distraction that silence and solitude will expose and help you slay. Another is not wanting to be a burden to others. And this is really a good thing, caring. I'm picturing about times when our girls were young and I was working, and it just felt selfish for me to go take times. And as an introvert, I definitely needed them. It just felt selfish to me to abandon my family, to go seek times of silence and solitude. And especially some of you may relate to that. But I want to suggest a slightly different idea, that it actually can be good for your family for you to get away. It forces them to deal with aspects of their souls that are untended when we're present. The bottom line is they need God more than they need you. They might just not know it yet. And so with prayer and careful consideration to make sure their needs are covered, I'm suggesting that this is actually, if this is your excuse or reason why you don't do this more, it's something you may want to consider. You are limiting their growth by not ever taking time to step away. And then I'm going to focus on this fifth one, and this I think is the biggest one. Fear of what we might have to face. I think it's probably true for you, but the quieter things get out here, the louder they can get in here. Louis Boyer said, "Solitude is a terrible trial, for it serves to crack open and burst apart the shell of our superficial securities. It opens us up to the unknown abyss that we all carry within us and discloses the fact that these abysses are haunted." Silence and solitude actually amplify the noise of the struggle in here that has been drowned out by the cacophony of other noises in our everyday lives. Silence and solitude are a place of renewal, but it's also a place of refining. Yes, we better hear the voice of God when the other sounds diminish, but we also face the darkness there. Sometimes solitude is stepping out of a battlefield. Sometimes it's stepping into it. What I mean by this is when you actually do carve out time and say, I'm going to step away to be with God, the thoughts in our heads and the things that surface, scathing accusations, overpowering impulses, lies that have been hounding us, fears and insecurities, weaknesses and temptations. You know, the passage about Jesus, let's put it back up, Matthew 4. Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. That is an infinitive verb. It is the purpose of why the Spirit led him. The Spirit specifically led him to go chin to chin in a cage with the devil. And my point with this is that this is part of this was a necessary step for Jesus to be able to have the flourishing, successful life and ministry that he had. And I'm starting to think, well, wait a minute. I'm supposed to follow his footsteps. Maybe he's calling me to face some things that I've been trying to keep buried in the basement. And silence and solitude becomes a place where those things, the door opens and we have to face them. We face bitterness, shame, inadequacy, fear, depression, the laziness of our spiritual walk. So many times I have carved out time to go be alone with God, expecting it to just be amazing and awesome, and I find all of a sudden that it is a true battle. But I will say this, our Lord is our shepherd, and he leads us to green pastures and still waters, but sometimes we have to fight our way through jackals to get there. And there we eat a meal in the presence of our enemies. Outside the glow of his warmth at the campfire, we do see their eyes sometimes lighting up in the periphery. But if we can learn how to walk that line and do what Jesus did in clinging to his identity as a much-loved child and wielding the word of God, we're going to talk about that. That's a skill, that's a practice that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks. We will find, I think, that when the jackals see us coming, they flee. And that, I think, is why for Jesus, he didn't have to battle his way there. There was an initial battle, chin to chin, face to face with the enemy. He won and found that that path was now open, and it was a direct route to find the refreshment and the renewal that he needed with God. We will only survive silence and solitude if we are led into it by the Spirit of God, with our ears ringing with the truth that we are much loved children of a good Father. And this, I think, is one of the biggest barriers. We don't really believe God our Father is good. No matter how great your childhood was, no matter how awesome a dad or mom you had growing up, there's a sense of which we sometimes project onto God a disapproving father or somebody with impossible standards that we can never measure up to. And yet we see Jesus himself went into that time hearing in his ears, "You're my boy, and I'm so proud of you. I love you." And when we go into those moments knowing he is with us, nothing can separate us from his love. He promises to be with us to the end of the age. He who is with us is greater than he who is in the world. We'll be able to overcome some of those enemy attacks. He's already proven his love for us. We cling to it as we go into the stillness, into silence, into the quietness, and we face off the devil who's trying to tell us otherwise. And we'll win the battle. The angels will minister to us. Ministering angels will help us in this furnace of transformation. And what was initially a furnace becomes a warm fire that we gather around in the future to find our chilled hearts warmed, our broken hearts mended, and we go back into the fray of our daily lives and the difficulties that are going to face us completely better. Just like Grace and Colton talked about, a Sabbath time with God renews and strengthens them. Stillness and silence, seeking God and meeting him in those moments does it too. So I want to give you the challenge, and I want to give you some practical ideas. The challenge is to explore new ways to step away from people, to be alone with yourself and with God. Couple disclaimers. I'm not talking about just walking out of here and just keep on going and just never look back, never come back, and just abandoning all responsibilities. No. Please hear me in that, especially those of you in families, those of you with other responsibilities. This is to be done prayerfully. This is to be done cautiously, proactively, with making sure your bases are covered, right? But I gotta say it. I gotta say it right now to dads who say, silence and solitude, getting away on a spiritual retreat, that's for later when the kids are grown. No, your kids need you to do this so that you are the dad God has called you to be. I'm also not suggesting that we feed narcissistic, selfish intentions by just consuming silence and solitude and sort of forfeiting other responsibilities that are part of what it means to follow Jesus. So here's what I think it looks like. Micro and macro. What does it look like practically? Short times daily. I grew up in a tradition where we talked about daily quiet time. Anybody else hear that or know? Have you heard that? Just raise your hands. Daily, I'm just curious. Minority, I would say, in the audience. But I grew up with daily quiet time, and I got to tell you, I grew up seeing a mom and dad alone with God, scripture open, sometimes just looking out, knowing they were communing. It was just normal to me. I grew up with that. We'd go on a family vacation. Where's dad? I don't know. Oh, he's out by the fire reading his Bible. You know what I mean? That was just normal. That was part of the pattern. Daily quiet time, daily devotions. As much as we can say, I don't want to be legalistic, it is a means of grace for our transformation. But I want to stretch us to look even smaller than a daily quiet time. I'm talking about the moment when you wake in the morning and you're stirring out of your restlessness or your sleepiness, when you just pause for a second and you say, I love you too. I'm talking about the making of coffee in the morning and the sound of the grind or the pour or the drip, and in those moments saying, I trust you, Jesus. I'm talking about the walk to the bus or the drive to work, turning off the radio, taking the earbuds out, and saying, Jesus, I give everyone and everything to you. Even that time in the bathroom, just taking a deep breath, well, maybe not a deep breath, but just like drawing near and just, Jesus, These micro moments, sacred moments, sitting at the stoplight, turning off the radio. Yes, Lord. You know, just these little expressions. And then I want to stretch us to the macro. And I'm going to go ahead and have the band can come on up and get in place. These longer weekly, monthly, or annual rhythms, part of your weekly Sabbath. This has been huge for me. Part of my need for a Sabbath is community, but it's also the silence and solitude. So it's a part of a weekly rhythm. I'm talking about a friend. He's here in the room. He does spiritual retreats. He just plans them, 1 or 2 a year minimum, a weekend or an extended weekend to get away. I'm also talking about the night vigil. Finding silence and solitude in the middle of the night when you don't have to impose it on others. Yeah, there are people who set an alarm for 2:30 a.m. to get up to be with the Lord. And some of those people do it in their busiest seasons because they know they're not going to make it without God meeting them and ministering to them. Here are some guiding principles. No matter how well you think you do at this or how crappy you feel like, it is possible for you. There's more for you. Experiment with it. Just do it prayerfully. Ask God to give you ideas. Don't compare yourself to others. This is practice, not performance. Nobody's submitting any time cards. Start with something small, doable, and modest, like 5 minutes this week. Last night in the Saturday group, we were talking, and the guy said, my challenge is I'm going to journal for 30 seconds a day. And his point was, if I start to do it for 30 seconds, it's going to become more than 30 seconds, but I'm making it small. I'm setting a goal, 30 seconds a day, I'm going to journal. So start small, and then identify, account for, and adjust to your personality, season, and stage of life. Some personalities want and need more of this. Some seasons of life might be harder, in which case you might need it even more. And your stage of discipleship. When we're doing deep inner work, there's times we need more silence and solitude. And so, what are you going to find when you get away from noise and people? You're going to find a place where Jesus and countless of his followers have found life, renewal, refreshment, and the refining that cuts off the bullies and the jackals that have been hunting you and causes them to scatter so you go back into your busy life and your responsibilities refreshed, renewed, and empowered to just live it out with joy. I had one last thing, and then we're just going to sit in a moment of silence. I was thinking about Genesis chapter 1 and Adam and Eve walking in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day with God. And I was thinking about Jesus alone in a desolate, barren place. Or Jesus finding a quiet corner in a building somewhere, a little closet, you could say, and how that becomes a portal back to what God intended. Walking with God, our Maker, knowing his love as a Father, being safe and being made whole. What starts as a struggle will become a delight. Let's try it. Let's try it this week. And let's try it right now. Let's just not do any music for a minute. And then they're going to lead us in a second to some worship.